John Anderson's ranch sat quietly on the edge of a sprawling suburban development, a stubborn island of solitude surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. It wasn't just the land he loved, it was the freedom. No HOA rules, dictating how he should trim his trees or paint his barn. No committees telling him what flowers to plant or what colors to avoid. Just the wide open sky, the creak of weathered wood, and the steady rhythm of nature. For years, John had escaped the suffocating rules of the homeowners association that governed the neighboring community. When he bought this property, he made a promise to himself. He would live on his own terms, away from the endless red tape. Here, he was the master of his own domain, but peace was a fragile thing. It started innocuously enough. An unsigned letter slipped through his mailbox, urging him to consider community standards. John shrugged it off as a mistake or an overzealous neighbor. Then a second letter arrived, this one formal and from the HOA itself. They wanted him to remove his old wooden fence because it didn't meet their aesthetic guidelines. It was the first crack in the wall. John's response was simple: no. He wasn't about to tear down the fence that had stood for decades, the fence that marked his sanctuary. The neighbors might have felt differently, but John's ranch was his refuge, and he wasn't giving it up. That defiance sent ripples through the community. The HOA board, a group of well-dressed, polished neighbors wielding their power like a club, saw John's refusal as a threat. In their eyes, the neighborhood's pristine image was at stake. The perfect lawns, the coordinated colors, the immaculate sidewalks. John's ranch stuck out like a wildflower in a manicured garden. John knew he was on a collision course, but he had no idea just how far the battle would go. One evening, as dusk settled over the valley, John stood on his porch watching the sky fade from gold to indigo. His dog, Rusty, lay lazily at his feet. The ranch was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of crickets. This was his sanctuary. Then he noticed a flicker of movement near the edge of his property, a shadow slipping behind the trees. John's heart quickened. Was it just a stray animal or something more? He grabbed his flashlight and stepped off the porch, the beam cutting through the darkness. The shadow vanished. He shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination, but unease gnawed at him. The next morning, John found his gate unlatched. The latch bent out of shape. No explanation, no note. Just a silent warning. Word spread quickly that John was resisting the HOA's demands. The board sent a delegation to his door, their smiles polite but their eyes cold. They offered him helpful advice and friendly reminders that no one was above the community rules. John listened but didn't budge. Behind closed doors, the HOA board grew restless. The fence was just the beginning, they whispered. If John wouldn't comply voluntarily, they'd find other ways to make him conform or leave. John felt the tension tighten like a noose. What started as a simple disagreement over a fence was spiraling into something darker. He had chosen this life to avoid conflict, but now conflict was knocking at his gate. At night, when the wind rustled the leaves and the stars blinked coldly overhead, John lay awake wondering how far they'd go to break him. He wasn't just fighting for a fence anymore. He was fighting for his freedom, and he was ready to stand his ground, no matter the cost. The morning sun burned away the last shadows of night, casting a harsh light on John Anderson's ranch. But there was no peace to be found here anymore. John's thoughts churned as he sipped his coffee on the porch, eyes scanning the perimeter like a man expecting trouble. Trouble had a way of finding him lately, a week after the gate had been tampered with. John woke to find an official-looking envelope slipped under his front door. The envelope was thick, heavy with the weight of unwelcome news. His name was typed neatly across the front, but no signature. Inside, a letter from the HOA spelled out a new demand. His livestock shelters were not compliant with community standards and had to be removed within 30 days. Failure to comply, the letter warned, would result in fines and legal action. John's jaw tightened. Livestock shelters? His horses and cattle depended on those shelters. They were functional, sturdy structures. Nothing fancy, but they had kept his animals safe through storms and scorching summers. The idea that some committee members, sitting in their air-conditioned offices miles away, would decide what structures belonged on his land felt like an insult. He crumpled the letter, but the message was clear. The HOA was escalating. That afternoon, John drove into town hoping to find some ally or advice at the local law office. The lawyer he met with, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, didn't sugarcoat things. HOAs can be aggressive, Lisa warned. They often use petty rules and fines to wear people down. But they can't just take your property or destroy it. You have rights. John felt a flicker of hope, but knew that rights sometimes weren't enough against a well-funded association with deep pockets and local influence. Back at the ranch, John's dog Rusty started barking furiously at the back gate. Just before sunset, John grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, heart pounding. There, taped to the gate, was a new note, this one handwritten and threatening. "You don't belong here. Comply or leave. This is your final warning." No signature, no hint of who had left it. John's hands curled into fists. This was no longer about fences or shelters. It was personal. Someone wanted him out, and they were willing to make it clear, quietly, but chillingly. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, John lay awake. The threatening note burned into his mind. The ranch, his sanctuary, was turning into a battleground. Over the next few days, things only got worse. His water pump malfunctioned mysteriously, and a week later his tractor broke down, both vital tools for running his ranch. Friends and neighbors offered sympathy, but also warnings. "You're poking the bear," one neighbor said cautiously. HOAs don't take kindly to being challenged. John knew he was isolated. Most neighbors had bought into the HOA's vision. The perfect community, orderly and quiet. He was the rebel, the outlier. But John wasn't about to back down. Not after all he'd sacrificed to keep this land and live on his terms. One evening, as John was repairing the broken fence post, a sleek black car rolled slowly past his property. The driver stared straight at him, expression unreadable. The car circled again before speeding away. The message was clear. They were watching. John's pulse raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't a man to be intimidated easily. This was his home. Determined to fight back, John started documenting everything. Photos of damage, copies of letters and notes, every strange visit or incident. If things escalated, he would need proof. Yet a nagging fear lingered beneath his. Resolve! What if this fight cost him everything? His home, his livelihood, his safety? As the days wore on, the threats became more brazen, more direct. A broken window, footprints near his barn at night, a silent war unfolding in the shadows of his peaceful ranch. John looked out over the fields one evening, the sky glowing crimson, as the sun dipped below the horizon. He knew the battle was no longer about compliance with HOA rules. It was about power, control, and breaking his spirit. But John Anderson wasn't a man who could be broken. He clenched his jaw, eyes steely. Bring it on. John's ranch was no longer a peaceful refuge. It had become a fortress under siege. Days after the ominous black car's drive-by, the strange incidents intensified. It started with small annoyances, but John knew better than to dismiss them as coincidence. His tools, wrenches, chainsaws, even his prized antique hammer, began to disappear from the barn. At first he thought he'd misplaced them, but when a neighbor mentioned seeing unfamiliar faces lurking near his property at odd hours, the pieces started to fit. One morning, John stepped outside to find his fencing wires slashed in multiple places. It wasn't a careless accident. The cuts were precise, deliberate. Livestock could have escaped, or worse, wandered onto busy roads. John's jaw tightened with anger and worry. This was no longer about HOA letters or warnings. It was sabotage. Someone wanted to break him, and they were willing to cross lines. But who? He called the local sheriff to report the vandalism, but without concrete proof or eyewitnesses, they could only file a report and promise increased patrols. John's frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. The law wasn't moving fast enough, and the damage to his ranch was growing. Nightfall brought little relief. Strange noises echoed through the property, footsteps crunching through underbrush. Faint whispers carried on the wind. One night, Rusty, his loyal dog, growled fiercely at the edge of the property line, his hackles raised. John grabbed his flashlight and peered into the darkness, but all he saw were shifting shadows. On another occasion, John found fresh footprints circling near his barn, close enough that any thief could have easily broken in. His heart pounded as he inspected the scene. Whoever was doing this wasn't just after property damage. They wanted to intimidate him, to send a message. John's neighbors, once cordial, now kept their distance. Some nodded politely, others avoided eye contact. Rumors swirled about his troublemaking ways and his refusal to play by the rules. A few warned him quietly to consider compliance before things got worse. But John was determined. He refused to let fear dictate his life. One evening, as dusk slipped into night, John sat on his porch with Rusty by his side, a shotgun leaning against the railing. His eyes scanned the tree line beyond his fence, alert for any movement. Suddenly, a rustle caught his attention, soft footsteps moving quickly through the underbrush. John stood, flashlight in one hand, shotgun in the other. "Who's there?" he called out, voice steady but firm. No answer. The footsteps stopped. A figure emerged, barely visible in the fading light, a man wearing dark clothes and a hood pulled low over his face. John's grip tightened on the shotgun. "State your business," he demanded. The figure said nothing and turned to run. John fired a warning shot into the air. The man vanished into the woods. Heart racing, John felt a surge of adrenaline and anger. Someone was trespassing, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Determined. To catch the saboteur, John set up makeshift cameras and motion sensors around his property. If they wanted a war, he'd give them one. Weeks passed with tense vigilance. Some nights were quiet. Others, the cameras captured fleeting shadows and glimpses of masked figures skulking near the fences. Despite the fear and uncertainty, John refused to back down. Each act of sabotage only steeled his resolve. He knew the HOA had resources and influence, but he had something they couldn't buy: grit and the will to protect his home. But as the attacks grew bolder, John couldn't shake the creeping suspicion that this war was personal. Someone on the HOA board had it out for him, not just because he defied their rules, but because of something deeper, something they wanted to bury. The ranch had become a battlefield, and John was the last man standing. He clenched his fists, eyes burning with determination. They had crossed a line. Now, it was time to fight back. The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses down on everything, thick and heavy. John Anderson sat by the fireplace inside his ranch house, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the worn wooden walls. Rusty lay curled by his feet, eyes half closed but alert. Despite the quiet, John felt a knot tighten deep in his gut. A premonition, or maybe the weight of the past week's threats catching up to him. He glanced at the clock, 11:42 p.m. The world outside was dark except for the glow of distant streetlights near the suburban edge. He turned off the lamp and prepared to head to bed, trying to shake the unease gnawing at him. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from the back of the ranch. John froze. Rusty sprang to his feet, barking furiously. John grabbed his flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air biting at his skin. His beam swept across the yard, landing on nothing but shadows. "Rusty, stay close," he muttered. He moved toward the barn, heart hammering, senses on high alert. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a faint orange glow flickering near the back fence. His breath caught. Fire. Flames were licking at the dry brush, growing fast. John sprinted toward the blaze, calling the fire department as he ran. The smoke thickened, choking the night air. His ranch, his home, was on fire. He tried to fight the flames with the garden hose, but the fire spread too quickly, fueled by the dry summer heat. Within minutes, the fire threatened to engulf his barn and the small outbuildings that held his tools and supplies. As the fire trucks arrived, John stood back, helpless, the roar of the flames drowning out his thoughts. The firefighters worked desperately to contain the blaze, but the damage was severe. The barn was lost, along with years of equipment and cherished belongings. The house was scarred, smoke-stained, and unsafe. John's heart sank as he surveyed the ruin. The official cause of the fire was listed as undetermined, but John had no doubt it wasn't an accident. He thought of the threats, the vandalism, the black car, the mysterious figures skulking near his property. The escalating campaign against him had culminated in this nightmare. His sanctuary had been attacked. But who? Was it the HOA? The people who had made it clear they wanted him gone? Or someone else, using the HOA's name as cover? John's world felt like it was crumbling, yet beneath the despair burned a new flame, rage. He wasn't going to let this go unanswered. In the days after the fire, John sifted through the ashes, finding charred remnants of his past. Photos, tools, letters, gone. The emotional toll was crushing. Neighbors offered sympathy, but many avoided meeting his eyes. The community was divided. Some whispered that John had brought the trouble on himself, others quietly admired his courage. John refused to be broken. He hired a private investigator, a tough former cop named Ramirez, known for digging deep and finding answers where others gave up. Ramirez's first visit to the ranch was sobering. The fire had been too precise, too targeted. Accelerants had been used, and multiple points of origin were identified, a classic sign of arson. John met Ramirez in his temporary trailer home on the outskirts of town. "This wasn't random," Ramirez said grimly. "Someone wanted this, fire. They planned it." John nodded, voice low but fierce. "And I think I know who." Together they began piecing together the evidence, a trail of threats, intimidation, and suspicious activities leading back to the HOA board members. But proving it? That would be another story. John's battle was no longer just about fences or livestock shelters. It was about justice and survival. Late one night, as John stared out at the blackened remains of his ranch, he vowed silently, they would pay, no matter the cost. The days following the fire blurred into a haze of smoke, ash, and frustration. John Anderson barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames devouring his ranch, his life's work reduced to rubble. But amid the devastation, a steely resolve grew inside him. He would find out who was behind the fire, and he would make them pay. John's new ally, Ramirez, the private investigator with a reputation for relentless pursuit, had already begun combing through the details. Their first priority was to uncover any connection between the fire and the HOA's growing hostility toward John. Ramirez worked quietly, blending into the community like a shadow. He started by interviewing neighbors, many of whom were wary, some outright hostile. They were tight-lipped about the HOA's inner workings, but a few whispered of secret meetings and underhanded tactics. One evening, Ramirez called John with a breakthrough. "I found something," Ramirez said, his voice low and tense. A cache of HOA meeting minutes. Hidden, not in any public record. These notes suggest the board discussed solutions to the John Anderson problem. And it gets worse. They mention using forceful measures if he doesn't comply. John's blood ran cold. "This isn't just about a fence or shelters anymore," Ramirez added grimly. "It's a targeted campaign." The two met late that night in John's temporary trailer, surrounded by boxes of salvageable belongings and charred memories. Ramirez laid out the documents, marked with phrases like intimidation tactics, escalate pressure, and even eliminate resistance. John couldn't believe his eyes. Someone in the HOA was orchestrating more than just neighborhood rules. They were planning harassment, sabotage, maybe worse. But who? And how deep did this conspiracy run? Determined. To get closer to the truth, John attended the next HOA meeting disguised as a concerned resident. His heart pounded as he sat quietly in the back, listening to the polite smiles and rehearsed speeches that masked the tension beneath. He watched the HOA president, a slick man named Carl Whitman, speak confidently, dismissing concerns about community standards and property values. But there was something cold, calculated in Whitman's gaze, a man used to wielding power without consequence. After the meeting, John discreetly followed Carl to a nearby parking lot. He kept his distance but caught fragments of a heated phone. "Call. We've got to shut him down before he ruins everything," Carl hissed into the phone. "No more warnings. It's time to act." John's heart sank. The threat was real and imminent. Back at the ranch, John and Ramirez pieced together a timeline linking suspicious events, tampering with his gate, stolen tools, the broken water pump, to people connected with the HOA board. The more they dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a neighborhood feud. It was a vendetta. But collecting evidence strong enough to hold up in court was proving difficult. Many actions had been indirect, subtle, planted rumors, anonymous notes, veiled threats. One night, John awoke to the sound of footsteps outside his trailer. Rusty growled, low and protective. John grabbed his flashlight and peered into the darkness. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, someone trying to slip away. He ran outside but found only a hastily dropped envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a single note. "The truth is in here. Use it wisely." With trembling hands, John plugged the drive into his laptop. Inside were recorded conversations, secret meetings, phone calls, implicating several HOA members in planning harassment and intimidation against him. The recordings were damning, but more startling was a conversation between Carl Whitman and an unknown accomplice, discussing the fire and ensuring no evidence pointed back to them. John's jaw clenched. They had crossed the line from threats to outright crime. He looked at Ramirez. "This is it. This is what we need." Ramirez nodded. This could bring them down, but exposing the HOA's dark underbelly would come at a cost. The board wouldn't go down quietly. John knew the fight ahead was bigger than anything he'd imagined, and now it was personal. The courtroom was tense, charged with an electric mix of anticipation and hostility. John Anderson sat at the plaintiff's table, his eyes steady, his jaw set. Across the room sat the HOA's legal team, slick, polished, confident. They were used to winning, but John was no ordinary homeowner. Armed with the damning recordings and the hidden meeting minutes Ramirez had uncovered, John's attorney laid out the case. A deliberate campaign of harassment, intimidation, and ultimately, arson orchestrated by the HOA board to force John off his ranch. The judge listened intently, flipping through the documents and listening to the chilling recordings that exposed the HOA's secret meetings. The courtroom buzzed as witnesses testified, neighbors who had witnessed suspicious activity, the private investigator who pieced the puzzle together, and John himself, recounting the night his ranch burned. The HOA's defense team argued that The association was merely enforcing community standards, accusing John of exaggerating and breaking the rules himself. But the evidence was overwhelming. The anonymous notes, the sabotage, the threats, they pointed to a coordinated effort to terrorize John. Throughout the trial, John's resolve never wavered. Each piece of evidence brought him closer to justice and made his opponents more desperate. Rumors spread that the HOA board members were scrambling behind the scenes, trying to silence witnesses and manipulate the narrative. Outside the courtroom, tensions spilled into the neighborhood. John's allies stood by him, but others whispered that he was rocking the boat too much. Late one night, John's trailer was vandalized, a message scrawled in red paint. "Leave now, or worse will come." John didn't flinch. With Ramirez's help, he tightened security, installed surveillance, and prepared for the long haul. Weeks passed. Media began picking up the story, an underdog homeowner battling a powerful HOA over corruption and intimidation. Public opinion started to shift. John was no longer alone. Then, a surprising twist. During cross-examination, one of the HOA board members cracked under pressure. A videotaped confession surfaced, revealing how the fire had been planned and who had pulled the strings. The board member implicated Carl Whitman, the HOA president, as the mastermind behind the campaign against John. Whitman denied everything, but the damage was done. The trial became a media frenzy, exposing deep-seated corruption in the HOA and shaking the community to its core. John felt a mix of vindication and exhaustion. This fight had taken everything, his peace, his home, his trust in neighbors, but it had also revealed the truth. As the trial moved toward its climax, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Would justice prevail? Or would power and money crush one man's fight for freedom? John sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the judge. No matter what happened next, he had made his stand. He had shown the world that no one could burn down his home and his spirit and walk away unpunished. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. John Anderson sat with clenched fists, every nerve taut. Months of battle had led to this moment. His fight against the HOA, a David versus Goliath struggle, was about to reach its climax. The judge's voice broke the tension. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimonies, this court finds the defendants, the HOA board and its members, liable for the damages caused to the plaintiff, Mr. John Anderson. A murmur swept through the courtroom. John allowed himself a small breath of relief, but stayed focused. The judge continued. The defendants are ordered to pay restitution totaling $600,000 for property damages, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The courtroom erupted with a mix of shock, celebration, and disbelief. John's attorney shook his hand firmly. The fight had been long and brutal, but justice had been served. Outside, cameras flashed as reporters swarmed John. He spoke calmly, sharing how standing up against intimidation wasn't easy but necessary. However, the victory was bittersweet. The HOA board members resigned amidst scandal, but the community was fractured. Neighbors took sides, and John found himself isolated in some ways, hailed as a hero by some, yet branded a troublemaker by others. Rebuilding the ranch was daunting. The fire had destroyed not only buildings and equipment, but years of memories. Financially strained and emotionally worn, John faced the immense task ahead. Despite the payout, the money couldn't erase the scars, the sleepless nights, the threats, the betrayal by those he once called neighbors. Yet John remained unbroken. With renewed determination, he began restoring his ranch piece by piece, refusing to let fear or hate win. In the months that followed, John became an advocate for homeowner rights, speaking out against HOA abuses and helping others who faced similar battles. But just as things seemed to settle, a new letter arrived. No envelope, no signature. Inside, a simple message. This isn't over. John's pulse quickened. The fight for his home had taken a toll, but the war might not be done. He folded the letter slowly, eyes steely. Whatever came next, John Anderson was ready. John Anderson stared at the anonymous letter in his hand, the chilling words etched like a warning. "This isn't over." A cold shiver ran down his spine. After everything, the fire, the court battle, the vindication, he had hoped for peace. But this message suggested otherwise. The community had fractured beyond repair. Many neighbors avoided him now, some with resentment, others with fear. Yet, the letter was a stark reminder that there were still shadows lurking, unseen enemies waiting to strike again. Determined to uncover the truth, John took the letter to Ramirez, his trusted private investigator. Ramirez ran the envelope through their forensic equipment and uncovered something startling: faint fingerprints not belonging to any HOA board member or known associate. Digging deeper, Ramirez tracked the prints back to a name neither of them expected: Sarah Whitman, the estranged sister of the HOA president, Carl Whitman. Sarah had left town years ago under mysterious circumstances, but records showed she had recently returned. Quietly, under the radar, John and Ramirez arranged to meet her at a local cafe, tension thick in the air. Sarah appeared nervous, eyes darting around as if she feared being watched. "I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "But there's more to this story than you know." John listened intently as Sarah revealed a hidden web of betrayal within the HOA. Carl Whitman had used his power to cover up illegal dealings, property flips, bribery, even attempts to intimidate homeowners who resisted his control. But Sarah had opposed her brother, secretly gathering evidence to expose him. "The fire," she said quietly, "was meant to silence you. But I helped leak those recordings. I wanted justice." John felt a mix of relief and suspicion. Could he trust her? Before he could ask, Sarah handed him a flash drive, a trove of incriminating documents and emails proving Carl's corruption. As they parted ways, John realized this was only the beginning of a larger battle. Back at his ranch, as he reviewed the files, John noticed a final shocking revelation. One of the HOA members involved in the scheme had a close connection to a powerful local developer interested in buying out the ranch. The pieces fell into place. This wasn't just about rules or grudges. It was about greed and control. John's fight was bigger than a neighborhood dispute. It was a fight against a corrupt system bent on crushing anyone in its way. With the new evidence, John planned a second lawsuit, this time targeting the developer and complicit parties for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted extortion. The story made headlines again, capturing national attention. John became a symbol not just of resistance, but of courage to stand up against corruption on any scale. Yet even as he gained allies and momentum, the anonymous letters continued to arrive, threatening, cryptic. One evening, as John locked up the rebuilt barn, he found another envelope taped to the door. Inside was a single photo, a recent shot of his family home taken from a distance, with a shadowy figure lurking nearby. The message was clear. The fight wasn't over. It had only evolved. John looked up at the darkening sky, heart steady but alert. He had faced fire, intimidation, and betrayal, and he had survived. Whatever the next chapter held, John Anderson was ready, because some homes are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The end.